Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion topic. And this time out I want to talk about Azula again. Now when I was thinking about doing this topic, I was like, I'm repeating this topic. I know I've definitely talked in depth about Azula before. And in my mind, I was convinced that this is a topic that I'd covered like roughly like once every year or two. But then I went back and looked on the channel and I was kind of like, oh, actually, like the last time I did an Azula discussion was like back in 2017, and I had actually only done I think one before that in like 2015. So this will actually be the first time I think in a just full-on I'm discussing Azula video, covering Azula in quite a while. Now, part of the reason for that is that the unfortunate thing with Azula, but also the thing that continues to make her such an interesting and fan favorite character, is that she has a clear, open character arc. It's an important one, but we haven't come back to it in all of that time. Like, I felt like back in 2017, doing that video, like, what, like almost a year on, I think, from the release of Smoke and Shadow Part 3, that I'd given this enough time, and it's only a matter of time. Really quickly, soon after that, surely they're going to announce the next comic, and it will be the continuation of Azula post Smoke and Shadow. Cut to middle of 2022 here. We still don't obviously have any path for where Azula's story will be told next. Now, part of the reason why I'm doing this here is that we actually maybe do have a glimmer of hope for more Azula, and that is that one of the rumors about one of the upcoming Avatar Studios projects is that one of the movies is going to be a Zuko focused movie. We don't know anything about it beyond just Zuko focused, but if it is Zuko focused, that likely means his family dynamics, which are one of the more important topics that relate to Ursa, Azula, of course, and more, will have to come into play. And realistically, it's going to have to be set in between, basically in balance, the last comic forward in the timeline and Korra. And I think they're going to lean towards it being closer towards the comics than it is towards Korra, in that it might be somewhere more in the middle where we get like maybe mid-20s, early 20s, which is a bit of a time skip on from where the comics are, but not too much. But realistically, if they do it, they're going to have to address stuff featuring Azula, because we know so little about where she goes, regardless of kind of where they choose to set it there. Azula will have to come into focus. Ursa will have to get explanation, because obviously that only happens in a comic, and that will need to be explained to people who are mainly only watching the animations. And that's why I think it's important to have this discussion here. So the focus of this will not be necessarily on like just general Azula character discussion, and more where does she go from here, the character arc of Azula as it is in the comics right now. So let's get to that. I have a document here with a lot of the key comic panels. We'll come back to these topics a little bit later on. You know, the sympathy for the character, often like how much you have or don't have, often gets discussed in the fandom. Is redemption possible for a character like this? Gets brought up. Control through fear is obviously the main topic we'll get into. And then, like I said here, no post-Smoke and Shadow content for Azula, 6 years on from release. Yeah, Smoke and Shadow Part 3, March 16th, 2016. And Azula, I think in terms of actual content, has only made appearances in, what, Suki alone, which is actually like going back in time and filling in a little bit of a gap, and didn't really give us that much Azula in the grand scheme of things. And obviously here, possible option for the Avatar Studios Zuko movie is to have it be actually maybe more of an Azula focused plot overall. Now, for anyone who maybe needs a recap, hasn't read the comics in a while, let's get into some of the key moments with Azula in the comics. So we're mainly going to be referencing The Search here and Smoke and Shadow, primarily Smoke and Shadow Part 3. So this is just an important moment from flashback, in that the Azula-Ursa dynamic is obviously going to be essential to explore in more detail if we are going to do some sort of emotional arc involving Azula that leans towards redemption. These two need to talk, and haven't really talked. We'll get into the stuff from the end of the search in a moment. But it's important to note that even from the past, a lot of people like to frame Ursa as being a bad mother to Azula because she mainly just kind of gives out to her and stuff like that. But then you get moments like this. On the night she was banished, just before she goes to Zuko's room to do the same thing, Zuko happens to wake up. She does also go to see Azula as well, just before that. Azula doesn't wake up, and so we don't get that conversation. But it is significant that we do get to see this. She didn't leave Azula out in all of this. She does care. She does love Azula. So that's important to know in all of this because, you know, of the way sort of Azula acts in scenes going forward. So we then cut sort of into more of the present day stuff in the search, which towards the end gets to this situation here where she finally finds Ursa. But Ursa, of course, because of the whole plot point of what happened with Ursa, is now Noriko. And we have like Norin, Noriko, and so on. And we get this interesting dynamic. I've dreamed of this moment. And then we get the call from Ki saying, "Mommy," in relation to Azula's mother. And she says, "Tell me, mother, did you have to have a new daughter because your last one turned out to be such a monster?" So this is obviously referencing what Azula says in the beach episode, which we will get back around to talking about the beach quite a bit. But the significant thing there is that, you know, Azula opens up a little bit about how she, you know, it hurt for in her mind to be considered a monster by her mother. Even though she then later goes on to sort of like own it and say like, you know, it's true, but it did hurt. So you can see Azula's a bit manic at this point. So we'll cut to the actual confrontation that they have here. You know, "Oh really, mother, so I've imagined all of this. You haven't been trying to take me down from the moment I was born." And then we get this moment here. And it's what's interesting about this, of course, is that this is Ursa, but it is Noriko. So this is before she doesn't actually currently have any memories of Azula. But the intensity of what's going on here obviously forms this connection here. If what you say is true, if I really am your mother, then I'm sorry I didn't love you enough. And there is a connection here, as you can see. Like, Azula does begin to tear up. She does go to run off as the pages kind of go on. But what's significant is that, you know, that there's a little bit of a sort of this kind of admission here. But it's not complete because it's not like full Ursa saying this. But Azula is affected by this. But then you also have to remember in all of this that during the hallucinations that Azula was having in the finale, she did also hallucinate her mother saying, "I love you, Azula." So it's one of these dynamics where Azula has this sort of conflicting view on how her mother saw her, where she at the same time knows her mother loved her, but also has this feeling that her mother considered her to be a monster. Now, it's an interesting dynamic where is that herself kind of almost thinking that about herself rather than it being that she thinks her mother thinks that way about herself. It's an interesting one, and that's what makes the character so interesting to kind of discuss. So the thing I wanted to talk about here is mainly the Zuko line to Azula, in that there's obviously a few key dynamics that Azula is going to need to address as we go forward that will make plots so interesting. First and foremost, obviously Azula Ursa is the one everyone's going to talk about. But there is also a need for Azula Zuko, brother and sister, to also have more development and go on. The other ones, of course, would be Mei and Ty Lee as her friends who kind of, you know, quote unquote betrayed her. But we'll get into that as we go on. So we get this situation here. That morning at Cliff, Azula, our relationship is so messed up. It's been like that as long as I can remember. And maybe it'll be like that for the rest of our lives. But one fact never changes. No matter what, you're still my sister. And she runs off. Zuko tries to follow her. "Come back, please. I can help you. I want to help you." And this is Azula's last moment in the search. And we don't see her again until obviously in early parts of Smoke and Shadow, you can maybe figure out that it's Azula, but effectively not until early Smoke and Shadow Part 3 does Azula come back into play. Same as always, Zuzu. Even when you're strong, you're weak. And this is where she runs off. And this is obviously before, like literally just before Ursa gets her memories back, her face is changed back into being actual Ursa. She runs away just before, like, the things that probably would really help her get to happening. So it's a real sort of teaser of what could have been. If she just stuck around a little bit, it would have been very interesting to see how Azula would have interacted with a newly kind of back Ursa with all of her memories. But like I said, we go into Smoke and Shadow, and it's mainly just a few things I want to point out here. The connection with Ozai, it feels like that's been, for the most part, dealt with. Perhaps we can get around to maybe Azula needing to have a little bit of an Ursa in Smoke and Shadow moment where she confronts him and, really just says her piece to him. Like, it was great when Ursa said it, but I wonder how Azula feels about Ozai if she had, like, character development, because would she reflect back like Ursa and Zuko are able to do and just realize how cruel and kind of unloving this character is? And that I think the most significant thing for Azula would be, can she realize that effectively Ozai ever used her as a tool to further his goals? And I think when she realizes that it was effectively Ozai, in a way, controlling her in a way, manipulating her to do what he wanted, never really out of love or anything like that, that would be very interesting to see. But as we see already in Smoke and Shadow, her opinion is not much of Ozai. Once she comes to pretty much a conclusion towards the end of the search and throughout Smoke and Shadow, she just sees like, oh, he doesn't have his bending anymore, he's never getting it back, why should I care? He's not part of her plan going forward. So that's, it's interesting in a way in that it means that I don't think Ozai is going to be central to any sort of major character growth from Azula, and it would just be more of a kind of final note after most of the development has happened if we do come back to Ozai. Next, when she's talking to Mei, she obviously talks about the whole Kamurakage thing and how she latched onto this as being her new disguise because she remembered that Mei in particular was quite fearful when they were younger about the Kamurakage kind of coming to get them. They are dark spirits, a legend born of fear and anger and revenge, my kind of ladies. And of course, they're the sort of words you associate to a degree with Azula, especially the first one there, fear. Not necessarily that Azula is afraid, but that she controls other people through fear. But because of that, she has a fear of that control not working on people, because we've seen the effects when it doesn't, and that's part of it as well. And because of that, she's angry, she kind of feels she needs revenge to a certain degree. You can see that even though Smoke and Shadow and what Azula is doing here is meant to be this kind of signifier that she has moved past the breakdown sort of phase of her arc, which is end of the finale and the state that she is in, and how manic she is throughout most of the search, she has managed to recapture like her composure. And she's back to like more or less full fighting strength for sure. Whereas Zuko was kind of easily able to best her throughout most of the search. She is back to being, typically kind of stronger than Zuko on average. And she's back to being sort of more calculating and manipulative. But her growth, as we'll get to here, is like good. She needs to be back more like this, I think, to be able to kind of have the growth, but she hasn't quite taken it in the right direction, as we'll see. So the next thing that's kind of significant in terms of where I think perhaps the character could go is this. She eventually leads Zuko to a confrontation down here in the crypt of the Fire Lord's, the first Fire Lord's most trusted advisor, who is sort of in a way forgotten to history. People only really remember the first Fire Lord, not their advisor. But I think this might be the direction that they head in here. That Azula inadvertently, in what she's doing here, if you interpret it a certain way, is kind of acting in a way as an advisor to Zuko. Like, I'll manipulate things so that you have to do this, advise you to go in this direction, and this will make you better. The problem is that she doesn't realize that her perspective on what is better or not is skewed by basically the fact that her worldview is sort of defined by fear is the only way to control people. Because if you look at the quote that they use in the RPG game for Azula is the quote that, you know, trust is for fools, fear is the only reliable way. That tells you a lot, and this is an Azula who still feels that way about things fundamentally. And until she gets past that, we can't, I think, ever, truly move forward with the character. So that's the important thing to realize in all of this. But we didn't get to the point where, you know, Zuko's like, hey, you will never be Fire Lord. That's not your destiny, it's mine. And we get this kind of reveal here. Accept it, I've embraced it. I know I will never be Fire Lord because I'm not meant to be Fire Lord. You were right all along, Zuzu. Once I discovered my own destiny, the voices in my head finally shut up. I felt weightless ever since, free, maybe for the first time in all my life. And Zuko's like, that's great, but what? My destiny, you see, is to make you into the Fire Lord I tried to be. One who's strong, who rules through fear. So it's kind of like progress, very much progress, that this is the thing that has managed for her to, in a way, regain control of her mind, you know, regain her composure. But then she sees this progress, and what she takes from it is that, okay, I'm not meant to be Fire Lord, but I have to be exactly the same way I was before to force you to be the Fire Lord I was potentially meant to be. And it's this situation where it's like, yes, 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 yes. No, Azula, that's not it at all. So it's Azula, in a way, getting her destiny wrong here. Because this is the first time we're really seeing this whole idea of like Azula and her destiny. And it's sort of similar for Zuko, where, you know, he also, to a degree, misinterpreted his destiny. Iroh also misinterpreted his. So it kind of makes sense that on the arc that we're going on with Azula, she too is misinterpreting what path she necessarily needs to go on. I think there is some validity to what's happening here. Is the idea here of like, this is wrong in terms of like, she doesn't view Zuko as being strong when he actually is. It's just her definition of what makes someone strong is very skewed. Rule through fear is the thing she needs to get past, not something Zuko needs to adopt. The whole idea of make you is more like advise you. You know, the two of them leading the Fire Nation sort of side by side. Zuko as the actual ruler, but Azula to be the backup for the situations where Zuko is not good at. Because I think there has to be an acceptance that, like, at least across the comics, that Zuko is sort of the leader the Fire Nation needs at this point, but he's not a perfect leader and probably needs an advisor like an Azula to help him in certain situations. That I'm not going to completely dismiss a lot of what goes on, because like let's address this one, the page here. In the last 24 hours, I've shown just how ruthless you can be. Deep inside, you're still one of us. You can die for a little while, but eventually you will become just like me. And then, in a sense, I'll be Fire Lord again. No, you're wrong. Take your own advice, Zuzu, and accept it. It's who you are. Now, Zuko goes on to give a speech at the end that very much denies this. He actually apologizes to the people for not handling the situation as well as possible. And Azula's left at the end. Azula ends Smoke and Shadow on top of the roof watching this speech and is just interesting in a way. That he has not gone down the path she wants him to, but she's clearly still set on doing that. And then every suggestion that we have had about, like, a hint as to where things go from here is that Azula does just continue to, with the other Fire Warriors, effectively cause chaos in the Fire Nation, just cause issues and incidents to happen. The RPG basically is suggesting this, that, you know, this is something that happens for a while, at least in the immediate aftermath of Smoke and Shadow and the comics, and so on, that's what they are trying to do. Create these chaotic situations that will force Zuko to be more of a ruthless Fire Lord. Now, if you phrase that more as Azula is helping to advise Zuko on a way to be like a stronger Fire Lord in the, I suppose, more reasonable definition of that term, and not strong in terms of how Azula is interpreting it, that's probably the position you want Azula to be in. Because Azula is sort of a very talented, you know, strategist, sort of. She's good at, like, politicking in certain ways. Like, there's a reason the Fire Nation did eventually take Ba Sing Se, and it was because of Azula, basically, like, 100%. She didn't have to break through the wall, even though she, obviously, with the drill episode, tried to do that. But she didn't need to do that, ultimately, to take it. She did it by her own skills and talents. And it's that sense where, if you could get Azula to a point where she develops and no longer has such a wild, like, world opinion of only controlling people through fear. That's the only thing that, like, she feels is the correct way to approach things. If you can get her to sort of see what Zuko's goal is for the Fire Nation, what the Zuko Iroh kind of dream for the Fire Nation being better, kind of what Izumi ends up, like, embodying in Korra with how she sort of leads the Fire Nation. If you can get sort of Azula a little bit more on track for that, and make her understand what he wants to do as a leader himself, and why this is strength in a different way, and Azula can just sort of be the slight shadow that Zuko needs as a leader. That he can remain the light of the Fire Nation, while Azula more advises on, this is one of the situations where you will have to be harder, tougher, because Azula struggles with decision making, and he says that is something that is always going to be something that he does struggle with. That doesn't necessarily seem to be a problem for Azula. So her as an advisor, especially if you can get her to be more in line with the direction that Zuko wants, could be quite interesting. Now, this all depends on what ultimate way every particular person wants Azula to develop. What do we view a redemption for Azula as being? To discuss this one. For me, I don't think Azula should get a full redemption. And by that, I basically mean the typical redemption arc that, say, a Zuko goes on, where by the end of his redemption arc, he has gone complete 180. He has gone from hunting the Avatar to effectively being one of Aang's best friends. He's a member of Team Avatar, having been an enemy to Team Avatar. There's no more of a shift than you can possibly do than that. And that is the sort of typical redemption arc as people think of it in their head. For Azula, I don't think it will ever be that. I can't see Azula joining Team Avatar. For Azula, I think the redemption is more of a character arc that takes her away from the very clear villainous edge that is kind of always there with the way she's going. Of, look at the way she was presented there at the end, that she's finally found her clarity again, but with that clarity she has decided that she needs to effectively manipulate Zuko to be Azula if she was the Fire Lord. Like, there's a sense for, like, you finally have it, Azula, but then you messed it up. That's a pretty crazy opinion to have. So redemption for Azula to me is effectively, I think, dealing with this. This is the thing that sort of holds Azula back and holds her still in the category as like she's a villain. And until she realizes the issue with this, I don't think you can actually develop her all that much. Whether through some sort of conversation with Zuko, Ursa, maybe even May and Ty Lee helping in some way. Azula has to deal with this, why this is the only thing she feels she can use, and what can she possibly like replace this with. I brought this up before, but the scene with Ursa talking to Ozai is quite interesting because of the dialogue that like Ursa says to Ozai, and the fact that she basically says to him like, you don't love anyone, your children, brother, anyone. You have no actual connection or love for anyone in your family, and because of that you are kind of pathetic and weak. She just completely goes in on Ozai. And because of the way like Azula was raised, there is that sense where Azula is, in very basic terms, like a mini Ozai to a certain degree. And part of why she does this is because she doesn't necessarily know how to form bonds with other people that aren't through this. Which is why, say, the few connections that she feels she has with people that maybe aren't related to this from her perspective, but are from the other, like May and Ty Lee and that friendship she feels she has, when that breaks, and like someone like May directly says to her, I love Zuko more than I fear you, telling Azula that our friendship to a degree is founded by the fact that I am fearful enough of you that I will follow you, but now there is something more powerful than that. And this is Azula's kind of key dynamic. You know, if that control through fear breaks, look at what it did to her. Two people kind of going against her, and a few other little things happening along the way, but for the most part, that kind of key event happening. What does that say? It says that it's not the right path. If just that breaking can cause her to have a mental breakdown, it speaks to the idea that there is a problem there. This is, I think, is also where we need to bring up the beach, because it's one of the few episodes where we get to see Azula act in more of a normal way, or an episode that addresses how not normal Azula is in a very like normal, realistic setting, which is teenagers kind of having a party, hanging out, beach fun, vacation. And Azula is very out of place in so many of these scenes. Instead of having fun on the kind of volleyball thing, she turns it into basically a military operation. That is not just winning the match, it's defeating, dominating your opponents. You see her actually be somewhat more normal. Again, like the whole little scene at the end where they have they open up over the campfire. That's some of the real Azula that comes out. But you also get it with the whole, when she calls Ty Lee a tease and sort of insults her over kind of how many boys kind of fling themselves at Ty Lee, and how she's jealous that Ty Lee finds it so easy to have those sort of kind of dynamics where she struggles with it. And this is where I suppose the whole how she was raised kind of comes in that it feels abundantly clear that Azula just was never thought any of this. It was just, this is how you interact with people in nearly every single situation. Anything else doesn't really matter. And that's why she doesn't really have any particular like love for characters. And that's why I brought up the whole Ozai scene. Of the same is sort of true for Azula, of like, but there's hope for Azula. There's no hope for Ozai necessarily, because he's never going to try and fix things with any member of his family. There's still time for Azula to do that and realize kind of what it is to care for people, love them, and create relationships through trust rather than fear. Which is why I brought up that quote earlier on. Trust is for fools, fear is the only reliable way. There we go. And in a way, it speaks to Azula's fear. She doesn't view forming relationships through trust as being reliable, and she's almost afraid of what would happen. Whereas she feels the ones that are formed through fear are reliable, but when they break, it breaks her. So there's so many interesting kind of complicated dynamics going on here that I think are very, very interesting. And so Azula asking Ty Lee for advice about how to flirt feels really normal and highlights what she's missing, and what she needs is just people to interact with her normally. And that's why her mother finally talking to her, like Azula being open to finally having that conversation with Ursa, Ursa having it, and the conversation going well, saying that I love you, and if Azula responded with the same thing, would be huge, absolutely huge, and that would like absolutely open the door. So I think there's a lot of room to get somewhere with the character, and it's really all about what would be a dynamic, a scene, a situation that would finally make Azula go, this is not the right way to do things. I need something else. And what would make her actually realize that trust, loyalty, love, like those kind of type of connections are the ones that she really, really needs. Because you can see, even though like she starts the kind of dynamic with Chan in the beach, and it actually begins to go quite well, they kiss, she immediately jumps to, we can be a power couple and dominate the world, and scares him off. And it's just, everything always comes back to sort of fear, domination, and that sort of thing. So this needs to be got past. And that's why it's so interesting that that's her dynamic in the show. And it's also her dynamic here. One who's strong, one who rules through fear. And again, it speaks to this idea of like, control through fear is a dynamic that she doesn't realize is wrong yet, and then her view on what strength really is very, very weird. And it's skewed, I guess, because of Ozai and him, what he views as being strength, and the idea that Ozai is actually this kind of weak character, not in terms of his power, but, you know, as Ursa was able to sort of kind of rip him apart when she finally spoke to him, because he is kind of fundamentally weak, she still has this thing from effectively Ozai. Because going into the other topic here, at the top here, the whole sympathy situation, there are people out there in the fandom who have no sympathy for Azula. Now, I don't really quite get that, because I lean towards, relatively heavily towards having quite a bit of sympathy towards Azula. It's maybe not completely over in that direction, because I do think there is a sense of Azula has some opportunity in situations to have a choice and make better decisions. But whereas Zuko, in a way, despite it being this kind of cruel thing, him being banished from the Fire Nation and what happened, being scarred by his father, it meant there was always like a fundamental disconnect between Zuko and Ozai. That Ozai never had too much of a direct, constant influence on Zuko. And because of that, most of Zuko, it comes from Ursa. And that's why, despite Zuko being somewhat like awkward in situations and intense, there is a good heart there underneath all of that. And it's clear, I think, you could see from the show and a lot of the flashback sequences, that Azula is very heavily influenced by Ozai. Very, very heavily. And you can tell that the second he realized she was talented, Zuko wasn't, he focused on her, and then that was double once Ursa was gone. Now, I do think there was a slight sense that Ursa being there and those scenes where she scolds Azula for her bad behavior were sort of keeping it in check. being those little constant things that just highlighted to Azula that this is not the right direction to go in. But I'm guessing Ozai just helped to facilitate that, and he wanted her to have that cruel edge that Ursa would criticize her for, and that's maybe where that sense of, you know, being a monster in a way comes from. And again, maybe there's a sense of like not realizing that, okay, you maybe feel your mother thinks you're a monster, but kind of who made you into a monster? And not realizing that it's Ozai, and Ursa was trying to help you, but you didn't quite let those lessons, those dynamics with your mother quite come into play. You know, I don't want to be overly sort of sympathetic towards Ursa and feel that like Ursa was like the perfect parent or anything like that. Of course, there are issues there with what happened. And so when we finally do eventually get an Ursa Azula scene, I do think it has to be on both sides. But I think you've already seen maybe the potential with Ursa. That even though this was like Noriko and it wasn't actually Ursa saying this, that you sort of know deep down that Ursa would say this to Azula. Whereas we don't quite know what way Azula would react if she properly replied to this situation. That's what's so interesting in all of this. But I do have sympathy for the character, because I don't think you can ignore the situation in that family, the focus that was placed on each child, and who Ozai focused on, who he didn't really focus on, and that Azula, in maybe not having as much time with her mother and having way too much time with her father, this is the conflict that she has. And this is where like I'd be very interested to see if there's maybe a chance for Iroh to help Azula through something. Because that is quite interesting that there are scenes when Iroh's like, no, she needs to be taken down. So he maybe doesn't see the potential for change in her. But I really don't think that the direction that they would take is just that Azula is a villain for life. I can't see it just being a situation where she's just a Kimura Kage for the rest of her life, and she just basically kind of haunts Zuko and causes chaos in the Fire Nation. I think there has to eventually be a shift that happens, and she gets incorporated into the family a little bit, because the thing about, like, I suppose these two together in a way, the redemption and like the sympathy for the character, is that I think a post-redemption Azula, I don't think is this drastically different character. I think Azula has to come out of her redemption arc still having that edge to her, that she is still cruel at times. She still does lean on manipulation quite a bit, but it's not the only thing that she has, and that's the key of part of the growth in all of this. That we need to see that situation where Azula can selectively be the Azula that we know when the time is right, but otherwise can just have a nice dynamic with Mei and Ty Lee, can have a better relationship now with her mother. And because of the kind of complex situation in the family, I'm very interested to see like how she would interact with Ki. We've seen that it's created a little bit of a jealousy angle here, but I'm so interested to see if, like, in a way, like how Ki is towards Azula, and if that can maybe crack through and get through to Azula. If Norin can, as a father figure who maybe cares, if he can maybe get through to her. Again, if we're maybe thinking that this will be told in a movie, it's going to be maybe a little bit more difficult because you have to introduce people to who Norin is, who Ki is. So I still think the focus will probably be on Ursa, Zuko, Mei, Ty Lee as being the key characters that will affect Azula. Azula will have to, show that there's potential in. Because I definitely think there was a friendship that, not just through fear, with Azula made Ty Lee, but obviously over time it became the sense that Azula felt that she needed to maintain the friendship through fear, and we saw how that affected May and Ty Lee. I'm interested to see like if those two noticed if like Azula was to change, and how ready or not they would be to try again with her. I think Ty Lee would be more the first one to jump on like back being friends with Azula. I think with May it would maybe take a little bit longer, but would get there eventually. And those are the dynamics that I think are quite good. Like we've already seen that Zuko wants to try. He doesn't like that things are so awkward and confusing between him and his sister, and it always comes to blows. He wants that to change, because he saw throughout the search that he kind of tried to be a better big brother to her, and he kind of asked Sokka for some advice on that. So he's trying. The next kind of feels like it is on Azula to, you know, I suppose it's on a character to realize what a lot of us as fans realize, that this is wrong. And to really call this out and just, you know, hit that like armor-piercing question that just makes her think and opens the door to, I need to change. And who will that be? How exactly will it happen? How long will it take? But I think that's the arc to go for. Because otherwise, like, I don't necessarily know what exactly the plot is, because otherwise it's just building Republic City, which we basically know what happens, and I don't know how much of a plot there necessarily is, especially for a movie. So it's either a threat to the city. Now, I'm okay with it sort of being maybe a few years on, Azula is maybe threatening to do damage to the about to be new Republic City, and Zuko just feels, I need to deal with Azula now. Otherwise, this new nation of nations might have a major problem on its hand. That feels like the most kind of, I think, ideal way to do it, where like he's kind of been somewhat okay trying to fix things, but he hasn't been able to sort of pin down Azula with regards to the Fire Nation stuff, but it just has to be done now. She can't mess up what's happening with Republic City, and we get our big moments that we're waiting for here. So we know the characters that need to come into play for Azula. I think we know what they need to tackle with the character, and that is, you know, this needs to change along with, I suppose, what she views as being someone who is strong. But you can see a lot of the dynamics, and even the comics. This is why I feel they were so good, is that they did hit on these moments really, really well. Like this glimpse of what a reunion between these two could be is fantastic. Zuko wants things to be better, wants to help, but this is an Azula who is not ready to change yet. And even though she does change going into Smoke and Shadow, in that Ozai doesn't seem to be at all something she cares about, she's back to the focus on fear, anger, revenge, control, that sort of thing. But I do like the idea of, like, I feel this is brought up for a reason. There's a symbolic reason why it happens in the First Advisor's crypt. That's maybe the position for Azula in the aftermath of all of this. Is that, yes, she's not going to be the future Fire Lord, but what if she is right-hand person for Azula, for Zuko, and she is this advisor? So she gets to sort of, in a way, have a hand in some of the decision-making, but it's in a position where she can do things in the right way, where Zuko can be the idealistic leader that he needs to be, that the world needs, but that she can also be there to help nudge him into direction when something more, you know, serious needs to happen, and that maybe Zuko can't quite bring himself to do that, but Azula is the one to be like, no, this needs to be done. And you can see there's so much potential here of her kind of finally realizing what path she needs to go on and her improving. But in the end, she comes to the wrong answer in my mind. At least that's always been my interpretation of this, is that it's like, great, no. And I think you can tell with Zuko here is that this, what Azula says here, ultimately doesn't have much of an impact on Zuko. This is not this character arc that Zuko's now in danger of going back and that he's really doubtful of himself. We'll see if they ever come back to this dynamic and they do address that the constant, you know, chaotic attacks from Azula are having an impact on Zuko as leader. But I feel pretty confident this many comics in that this is just Azula having come up with the wrong answer in the end. That he's never going to become just like who Azula was. He doesn't need to be ruthless to be the Fire Lord. The problem is that she still feels that even though it's not her who's going to be Fire Lord, but that the Fire Nation needs a Fire Lord like she would have been. That's the problem. And it's like she views this as being who Zuko needs to be, when the problem is that she doesn't quite know who she needs to be herself. So this is what makes her so complicated, is that I don't think in terms of that kind of comic gap between Avatar and Korra, there is another character with the same level of kind of depth or like of arc necessarily, because it feels like we've got the development for most of the other main characters, and it's just this and then a few other questions being answered about like, who's Sue's father? Is Mei and Zuko the endgame ship? Is Izumi their daughter, or what's going on there? Stuff on like, say, Sokka Suki, what happens there? Does Sokka ever have children? You know, those type of questions. A lot of just the why don't we know this yet type situations. But with Azula, it's just there's a story arc here in progress. When are we going to come back to it? We need to come back to it. And in terms of like analyzing it, like again, it's been like over 6 years. I understand, like say the last 2 years, why they haven't come back to it in any sort of media, because I think Avatar Studios has been somewhat in the planning stages, and they felt that, okay, this is why we need to stop the comics telling important stories, because we want to keep some of these important stories to tell in an Avatar Studios Avatar project. So recent times I get it. I'm not quite so sure why from say March 2016 to say the end of 2019, why in all that time we never really came back to Azula. I get it, we went on to then have North and South. There's a bit of a time skip as we went into the there was a bit of time jump in real world when we went to the new creative team going into Imbalance, and that more or less fills in the time. It felt like they had some final things they wanted to do with the previous creative team. They wanted to introduce the new creative team with something different. And then Avatar Studios happened. Because I feel like we were probably building towards maybe the second or third, like, Faith Aaron Hicks, Peter Wortman book to maybe be Azula. But obviously at this stage, I think it feels like it's going to happen in some sort of a movie or TV show project for Avatar. We'll see exactly what happens. But like I said, a Zuko movie that they put out in the cinemas, I can't see it really being anything else like except addressing some of those things. That this is the movie that will explain to people what happened with Zuko's mother, while also going on a few of the other things that relate to that, with regards to like Zuko finding his mother is the resolution to that, and that's nice. It's an emotional thing, him to finally find her again. But it's actually Azula and Ursa who have the more like characterful dynamic that needs addressing. So that'd be my kind of hope and expectations for this. And it's just kind of, I think everyone can agree on this, it's just kind of a more Azula content, please, soon. Confirm this, like, please. Because everyone has speculated about, like, you know, why didn't we see any sort of Azula stuff in Korra? Was she one of the characters who died in the meantime? What happened with her? Who knows? But it does feel like, based on the way Zuko is presented in Korra, that I get the impression that he sorts out a lot of the family drama stuff. And so whatever happens with Azula, it does end up nice enough, in my opinion, anyway. Because that's definitely the way I lean with Azula, is that is redemption possible? Yes, it just won't be like a full redemption. I think I can see her being on slightly better terms with a lot of the Team Avatar members without ever maybe being full-on friends with them. But for her, the most important thing is that I suppose she has a better relationship with Zuko, May and Ty Lee, trying to make amends with that friendship, Kiyi, Noran, those type of characters, maybe even Iroh coming in. Whether or not she has like unique dynamics with Sokka, Toph, Katara, Aang, that I don't think is as far as you need to go. For her, it's just anything that moves her away from this, I think, will be a path towards redemption. If they're not doing redemption, then they'll just double down on this. No one can ever convince Azula that this is not the way to do things. So right now I do feel sympathy for the character. Redemption is possible. This is what needs to be addressed, and hopefully it's the Avatar Studio Zuko movie that is what gets us there. So there's my, I suppose, updated 2022 discussion topic on Azula. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on the character. Do you think we'll finally come back to this major open plot point? What are your thoughts on Azula and everything I discussed here? Do you agree with me on what the key points in an arc for her should be or could be, or what? But yes, that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.